The first hint wasn't a meeting or an email. It was a dashboard. Marcus Hale had spent 27 years at the company, long enough to remember when servers lived in humming rooms behind locked doors, and the cloud sounded like a weather problem, like something a meteorologist would warn you about on the evening news. He started at the help desk at 28 years old, fresh off a failed attempt at a computer science degree that he'd abandoned when his mother got sick and the bills started stacking up like unpaid parking tickets. He answered tickets nobody else wanted. Password resets at 2 in the morning. Printer jams on the executive floor that somehow always happened right before a board presentation. The kind of work that taught you, slowly and without ceremony, how people actually use technology. Not how executives thought they did, not how the vendors promised it would work, but how it really worked, in the messy, human, improvised way that kept organizations functioning despite themselves. He worked his way up the slow, unglamorous way. Nights, weekends, certifications paid out of pocket, CompTIA, Cisco, ITIL, sitting at his kitchen table with textbooks and cold coffee while his wife Renata would fall asleep on the couch waiting for him to come to bed. She never complained. That was the kind of woman she was. But Marcus saw it. He saw it every night. He promised himself it was temporary. The promotions came years later than they should have, always with a handshake and a "we couldn't do this without you," and a salary bump that was exactly generous enough to keep him from leaving, but not generous enough to suggest they actually understood what he was worth. He learned to stop expecting anything different. He learned to measure his value not by what they paid him, but by what happened when he wasn't there. The systems that went dark, the escalations that spiraled, the junior staff who wandered the floor with the stunned expressions of people who had just realized how much they didn't know. There was a particular incident in his 12th year, a server migration gone catastrophically wrong on a holiday weekend that cemented his reputation permanently. The vendors team had already left. The on-call technician had panicked and done the worst possible thing, which was to begin improvising. Marcus got a call at 11:40 on a Friday night. He was at a cousin's birthday dinner in a restaurant with no parking and terrible cell reception. He stepped outside into a cold October drizzle and spent the next 40 minutes talking the on-call technician through a rollback procedure from memory, referencing configuration details he hadn't looked at in 8 months, and saving the company somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.5 million in lost transaction data. He never got a bonus for it. He got a plaque. He put the plaque in a box and never took it out. But after that night, people knew. When things broke and nobody knew why, they called Marcus Hale. By his mid-50s, he was a senior operations manager, technically middle management, unofficially the institutional memory of an organization that had grown too fast and documented too little. He didn't mind that he wasn't an executive. He had tried, twice in his late 30s, to push for a director-level role. Both times the position went to someone younger, someone with an MBA, someone who spoke with the kind of confident vagueness that sounds like vision but contains almost no information. Both times Marcus was asked to onboard his new supervisor and help them understand how things actually worked. Both times he did it without complaint. That was either his greatest strength or his deepest flaw, depending on who you asked. Renata thought it was the latter. She said it more than once, gently but clearly, the way she said most difficult things. You keep making yourself indispensable to people who will never promote you for it. Marcus would nod. He'd say she was probably right, and then he'd go back to work. What kept him going through all of it was something he never talked about out loud because it felt too much like counting money before the deal was closed. He had a pension, a real one, the kind that barely existed anymore in the private sector. A relic of an older era of employment that the company had never gotten around to eliminating because doing so would have required a renegotiation of contracts that predated the current executive team. It would fully vest in 3 years. 3 years. That number lived quietly in the back of his mind like a finish line, like a door at the end of a long hallway. He could see it. He just had to keep walking. Then came the dashboard. It showed up one Monday morning in early March, quietly rolled out across the operations team with a brief company-wide email that used the phrase "enhanced performance visibility" in the subject line. Marcus opened it the way he opened every new system, not with enthusiasm or skepticism, just with the slow, methodical attention of a man who understood that the details were almost always more important than the headline. The tool was called OptiCore. It was sleek, minimalist, the kind of interface designed to look inevitable, like something from a near-future film where everyone wears linen and speaks in complete sentences. Marcus clicked through it slowly, the way he always did with new software, resisting the impulse to skim. He traced the architecture in his mind as he moved from tab to tab. It tracked ticket resolution times, system uptime, incident patterns, response velocity, cross-department dependencies. It mapped workflow bottlenecks with a visual elegance that Marcus grudgingly admitted was impressive. None of the underlying data was new. It was all information the company already had, just presented through a layer of machine learning that assigned meaning to correlations a human analyst might have missed or ignored. He could see the appeal. He could even see the value. But then he saw the other thing. There was a tab labeled Workforce Intelligence. He clicked it. It opened to a grid of employee profiles. Not names, not immediately, but roles, tenure, productivity scores, skill assessments. Each profile had a bar chart showing something called an efficiency score, and beneath that, a secondary metric rendered in soft amber and red color coding. Marcus scrolled. He found his own profile. His efficiency score was high, in the top quartile of his department, which surprised him not at all. The incident response data alone would have carried him. But then he saw the secondary field. Potential for role automation, moderate to high. Marcus leaned back in his chair. He sat very still for a moment. 36 months. 3 years. The same number. He didn't panic, not yet. Marcus wasn't the kind of man who reacted emotionally to a system rollout. He'd spent nearly 3 decades watching companies chase the next technology, the next efficiency play, the next silver bullet. He'd watched ERP implementations crater multi-million-dollar projects. He'd watched outsourcing initiatives bring entire service departments to their knees. He'd watched chatbots deployed prematurely create customer service catastrophes that cost more to repair than the original investment. Systems were his domain. He understood them. He understood, more than most, the gap between what a system claimed it could do and what it could actually do under operational conditions. So his first instinct wasn't fear. It was the same careful, almost clinical attention he brought to any anomaly. He started asking questions, quietly, informally, the way Marcus always gathered information, not in meetings, not through official channels, but in hallways, at the coffee station, in the 5-minute conversations before and after things officially started. He had a gift for seeming unhurried in a way that made people comfortable. He'd ask a question and then just wait, and most people, if you waited long enough, told you far more than they intended. He learned that OptiCore had been rolled out across 4 other departments simultaneously. He learned that it had been developed by an outside vendor with a significant ongoing contract, one that included a licensing fee structure tied to headcount reduction, meaning the vendor had a direct financial incentive in its own recommendations. He learned that Daniel, his manager, had attended a 2-day strategy retreat in January where the phrase talent optimization had appeared in the agenda more times than the phrase performance development. He filed all of this away. At first, it was subtle. Younger hires started appearing on his team, not unusual for a department with occasional turnover, except these weren't typical entry-level employees cycling up through the help desk the way Marcus himself had. These were people with specific titles: AI Integration Specialist, Automation Operations Analyst, Digital Transformation Coordinator. They arrived with the quiet confidence of people who had been told they were the future and had no particular reason to doubt it. Fresh out of graduate programs. carrying laptops that cost more than Marcus's first car. They spoke in frameworks and models, in automation pipelines and predictive analytics, in the kind of shorthand that sounds like expertise until you realize it's obscuring the absence of it. Marcus trained them. Of course he did. That was his reputation. That was, as far as the company was concerned, his purpose. The guy who knew everything. The guy who made everyone else better. The organizational equivalent of a root system, invisible, underground, responsible for holding everything upright. Marcus, can you walk me through the legacy escalation process? A young woman named Priya, 26, sharp, asking with genuine curiosity, the kind that reminded Marcus of himself at that age. Marcus, how do you decide when to override the system alerts? A young man named Joel, barely 23, who had been hired specifically to manage the OptiCore dashboard and still couldn't explain why the system's latency thresholds were calibrated the way they were. Marcus, what's the workaround when the queue spikes unexpectedly on the third Friday of the month? This from a senior analyst who had been with the company 4 years and should have known better, but the answer lived in Marcus's head and nowhere else. He answered every question. He built documentation from scratch, real documentation, not the performative kind, but the kind that actually told you what to do when things went wrong at midnight and nobody with authority was reachable. He created training guides full of the specific, hard-won knowledge that doesn't appear in vendor manuals or certification courses. He even recorded walkthrough videos, 43 of them, indexed, searchable, at the request of a new operations coordinator who said the team needed to scale knowledge transfer. He told himself it was fine. This was how things evolved. This was how you stayed relevant. You adapted. You contributed. You kept adding value and trusted that value would be recognized. But he noticed things. He noticed that Priya, after 6 weeks of asking him questions every other day, stopped asking him questions and started answering other people's questions herself, using his answers, his frameworks, his institutional knowledge, without attribution. Not out of malice, but because that was simply how knowledge moved through organizations. You absorbed it and it became yours. He noticed that the 43 training videos he'd recorded had been uploaded to the company's internal learning system under the category OptiCore Integration Resources, which technically wasn't wrong, but stripped the context entirely. His 27 years of operational judgment had been packaged and filed under someone else's initiative. He noticed that when a junior manager named Trevor made a decision about escalation protocol that was technically supported by OptiCore's recommendation, but was, in Marcus's estimation, operationally reckless, and Marcus flagged it in writing, Daniel told him to trust the system and moved on. And then the org chart changed. His title stayed the same, Senior Operations Manager. The words on the door, if anyone still used office doors for such things, remained identical. But the structure beneath and around him was quietly, systematically hollowed out. Half of his direct reports were reassigned. They moved into a newly created automation strategy unit that reported to a vice president Marcus had never met, whose LinkedIn profile described her background as enterprise AI transformation, and whose tenure at the company was, at that point, 4 months. The other half of his remaining team consisted of junior staff with minimal experience, people who, through no fault of their own, had not yet developed the pattern recognition to know when a system's recommendation was wrong. They deferred. Not to Marcus, increasingly, but to OptiCore. Because OptiCore had a score, and a score felt objective, and objective felt safe. Marcus found himself managing less and explaining more. And then came the meetings. They started in April and increased in frequency until, by June, they were happening almost weekly. Just alignment sessions, Daniel said. Cross-functional check-ins to make sure we're all moving in the same direction. HR attended. Not always the same HR representative. Sometimes it was the woman named Linda who had been with the company longer than most and had the careful eyes of someone who had seen this before. Sometimes it was a younger man named Christopher whose energy always seemed slightly too brisk, like someone performing the role of engaged professional for an unseen audience. They took notes. Marcus watched them take notes and thought about what they were writing down and what they weren't. His manager, Daniel, had changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that wood changes in water. He had started speaking in the measured cadences of someone who had been coached. The language was always carefully chosen, rehearsed without sounding rehearsed, or almost. We're exploring ways to future-proof the organization. We need to stay competitive in a rapidly evolving landscape. We're not replacing people, we're enhancing capabilities. Marcus had heard enough corporate language over 27 years to know when something wasn't being said. The space around the words was often more informative than the words themselves. What wasn't being said, in meeting after meeting, was anything specific. Nothing about outcomes. Nothing about timelines. Nothing about what future-proof meant for Marcus Hale, personally, professionally, financially. He started pressing, not combatively, but precisely. When you say enhancing capabilities, can you give me a concrete example of what that looks like for my role in Q3? Daniel would nod slowly and say something like, "We're still defining parameters. Are there role changes coming that would affect my team's headcount? We're always evaluating structure to meet business needs. Is my position at risk?" A pause, a careful smile. "We're not making any announcements at this time." The real shift came during the annual performance review in September. Marcus had never had a bad one, not once in 27 years. His reviews were, historically, some of the most straightforward in the department. High marks across the board, the occasional stretch goal, a comment about mentorship and knowledge sharing that was always framed as a compliment. He walked into the review with the mild curiosity of someone expecting routine paperwork. Daniel slid the document across the table with a tight smile that Marcus had learned, over recent months, to read correctly. It was the smile of a man performing a task he found uncomfortable but had committed to completing. "Overall, solid performance," Daniel said, "but there are some areas for growth." Marcus picked up the document and read it with the attention he gave to everything. Not fast, not slow, just careful. Adaptability to new technologies needs improvement. He looked up briefly. He had been the first person in his department to request access to OptiCore's back-end architecture. He had submitted 3 documented suggestions for system improvements in the first 60 days, 2 of which had been quietly incorporated without acknowledgement. He kept reading. Delegation to automated systems inconsistent. He had delegated every appropriate task to OptiCore and had personally documented with timestamps and outcome data 17 instances in which OptiCore's recommendations had been incorrect or incomplete. He had flagged those instances through official channels. He had been told to monitor the situation. Alignment with future state operations, developing. Developing, he looked up. "Developing," Marcus said. Not angry, just stating it plainly, the way you state an observation about weather. Daniel nodded quickly with the energy of a man trying to get past a hard moment without stopping in it. And that's valued, it really is. But the expectation now is to lean into automation, trust the tools more. "I trust what works," Marcus said, "and I know where these systems break. That's not resistance, that's operational intelligence. That's literally the function of my role." "Sometimes," Daniel said carefully, after a pause that was exactly 1 beat too long, "experience can create bias toward legacy approaches." Marcus held his gaze. He let the silence sit there. Daniel did not look away, but he also did not look entirely comfortable. That was the moment. Not loud, not dramatic. No raised voices, no accusations, no Hollywood confrontation across a conference room table. Just a single word, bias, deployed with surgical precision to reframe 27 years of expertise as a liability. Marcus walked out of that meeting understanding something he had been approaching asymptotically for months, something he had known was there without quite letting himself see it clearly. The company was not trying to modernize. Modernization was the vehicle. The destination was simpler and considerably uglier. They were trying to remove people like Marcus, people in their 50s with significant institutional knowledge, significant salary history, and significant proximity to vested pensions, in a way that was slow enough to seem performance-based, documented enough to survive legal review, and plausible enough to avoid the phrase age discrimination appearing anywhere near a courthouse. This was not a technology initiative. This was a financial one. And Marcus, who had spent his career solving systems problems, understood that the first step in solving any problem was seeing it clearly. He saw it clearly now.